On the 16th of May 1968, residents of Ronan Point, a tower block in East London, were awoken by a deafening crashing sound. Many assumed that there had been an accident or explosion at a nearby factory, but when they got out of bed it was to find that the source of the sound was much closer to home. For many residents it was, in fact, right in their living room. At the end of the Second World War, Britain faced a housing deficit. Many homes had been destroyed by German bombs during the conflict, leaving only wasteland in their place. As peace returned, people started raising families once more. Especially within London, which had been hit hard by the Blitz, more housing was urgently needed. One way to provide cheap and plentiful housing was to build tower blocks. These could be constructed quickly and relatively cheaply, accommodated a large number of people, and took up only a small amount of land. At the time, tower blocks were considered an ideal, futuristic solution to the housing deficit. Ronan Point, constructed by order of Newham Council in 1968, was particularly cheap. The structure, which contained 110 homes, cost just £500,000, thanks to a construction method known as Large Panel System, or LPS building. Using this system, large concrete blocks and panels would be fabricated off-site, transported in, and bolted together to form the skeleton of the building. Joints between panels would be filled in with mortar to reinforce the connections. Not only was this method cheap and quick, it also required fewer skilled labourers. The system had been pioneered in Denmark, where it had successfully been used to construct buildings of 6 stories or less. Of course, with the huge demand for housing in London, taller buildings were preferred. Indeed, the government at the time offered subsidies for the construction of tower blocks with more than 6 floors, with further subsidies for tower blocks over 15 or 20 floors. For this reason, Taylor Woodrow Anglian, the construction company taken on to build Ronan Point, used a modified version of the Danish LPS method that they believed would be suitable for much taller structures. Thus, Ronan Point, along with several other similar tower blocks on the same estate, was built very quickly and on an exceptionally tight budget. In March of 1968, families began to move in to the brand new flats. Although few residents liked the external appearance of the building, they were pleased with the interior. Flats were spacious, well-equipped, and had the luxury of central heating. They would be ideal new homes for hundreds of Londoners. Just 2 months later, on the 16th of May 1968, 56-year-old cake decorator Ivy Hodge awoke in her Ronan Point flat and went through to the kitchen to prepare a cup of tea. She filled the kettle, placed it on the stove, and lit a match. Her next step would have been to turn on the gas supply and light it with the match, but before she could do so, she was blasted across the room by an explosion that knocked her unconscious. She thus did not witness what happened next. What happened next was the almost total destruction of her living room. The explosion blasted out the exterior wall, the load-bearing exterior wall. Without it in place, the wall of the flat above had insufficient support. It collapsed downward, as did the one above it and the walls of 2 further flats above that. This material fell downward, pancaking onto the flats below and causing a progressive collapse of one corner of the building that extended all the way from Ivy Hodge's 18th floor flat to the ground floor of Ronan Point. Almost all the flats in Ronan Point had a similar floor plan, and thus in most cases it was the living room of each unit that was destroyed by the collapse, although on some floors parts of the adjacent kitchen or bedroom were also involved. Due to the early hour at which the collapse took place, most residents were still in bed. Some survivors later recalled being awoken by the deafening sound of the collapse to find the wall of their bedroom missing, leaving nothing between them and a sheer drop to the ground below. In one case, a woman was left stranded on a ledge in what had previously been her living room. With a large part of the floor having fallen away, she could no longer reach the door, and was forced to await rescue by emergency services. Witnesses also recall seeing a man who, still on top of the mattress from his bed, was blown out of his flat and fell to the ground several floors below. He survived with only minor injuries, and by some accounts did not even wake up until he landed. Residents from all floors of the building evacuated down the internal stairwells. By the time the last few arrived at the doors of Ronan Point, a crowd had gathered outside, a crowd which applauded whenever another resident made their escape. Survivors were taken to a local school and offered cups of tea and brandy. One by one, they were painstakingly accounted for. Back at the site, police officers searched the rubble, equipped with polythene bags for the body parts they expected to find. In total, 17 people were injured in the collapse. 4 residents were killed. One of the injured, an 82-year-old woman, later died in hospital, albeit from what appeared to be natural causes. In the aftermath of the collapse, an investigation was launched. It was found that the direct trigger of the collapse had been a gas explosion. The stove in Ivy Hodge's flat had been installed incorrectly, with a substandard fitting that had been over-tightened during installation. This faulty fitting had allowed gas to leak into the kitchen, accumulating until a match was struck and it ignited. This had blown out a load-bearing wall, precipitating the collapse. The government ordered that Ronan Point be rebuilt and reinforced so as to be able to withstand damage to a single unit without it resulting in a progressive collapse. Other similar tower blocks would also be reinforced to prevent progressive collapse. Additionally, the gas supply would be removed from Ronan Point and the other buildings on the estate. Residents would use electricity only for heating and cooking from that point on. The collapsed corner of Ronan Point was rebuilt, and the building was thoroughly reinforced. In 1973, families who had been evacuated following the collapse were invited to move back in, but very few did so. In fact, only one elderly couple returned to Ronan Point. New tenants were sought for the remaining reinforced and rebuilt flats. Some questions remained unanswered, however. The explosion that started the collapse had been a relatively small one. Ivy Hodge had survived. Her hearing had not been damaged by the blast. Even the stove itself had weathered the explosion and remained in working order. The building had now been reinforced against progressive collapse. But should such a small explosion have been able to blast out the external wall of even a single flat in the first place? An independent architect, Samuel Webb, developed an interest in Ronan Point after hearing about the disaster. Residents invited him to visit their flats, and he conducted a series of informal tests. He found that he could drop a coin down behind the skirting board in one flat and have it fall all the way through to the flat below. Something that, he surmised, should not be the case in a soundly constructed building. Residents also noted that flats leaked, and damp was a continuous problem. Some residents even noticed cracks in their walls. Complaints to the council would often result in small repairs that only temporarily mitigated these issues. Newham's Housing Committee invited Mr. Webb to survey the whole building. Assisted by a team of architecture students, he did so, and reported back that they had found numerous cracks throughout the structure. He said that Ronan Point was beginning to break up, and was held up only by the reinforcements that had been made after the public inquiry. He also noted that the joints between concrete panels, which should have been filled with mortar, were often filled with nothing at all, or with wads of newspaper, cigarette cartons, and other waste material. Further tests also revealed that the building was vulnerable to fire. A severe fire in Ronan Point could pass through fire doors that should contain it for 1 whole hour in just 11 minutes, and a fire of sufficient magnitude could possibly lead to the collapse of the entire building. Indeed, even a particularly strong storm could also have caused the building to collapse. These concerns, bolstered by a petition and numerous complaints from residents, eventually led to the evacuation and demolition of Ronan Point. On the day when the sign above the main entrance was removed, the very first step in the building's demolition, ex-residents celebrated, cheering and drinking champagne. They were delighted that, after years of worry and stress, their concerns were finally being taken seriously and they were being rehoused. In addition to Ronan Point, 8 other tower blocks were also demolished. This was a painstaking process, with the buildings disassembled piece by piece, and architects and other experts invited to examine the site. Samuel Webb commented, "I knew we were going to find bad workmanship. What surprised me was the sheer scale of it. Not a single joint was cracked. Fixing straps were unattached, leveling nuts were not wound down, causing significant loading to be transmitted via the bolts. Panels were placed on bolts instead of mortar. But the biggest shock of all was the crucial H2 load-bearing joints between floor and wall panels. Some of the joints had less than 50% of the mortar specified." Ronan Point and the other high-rise buildings on the estate were removed and replaced with low-level housing. Ronan Point and the estate it had been a part of had lasted, in total, just 18 years, when its expected lifespan had been closer to 60. Though the government ordered strengthening works be carried out on similar buildings across the country, this wasn't always done. In 2017, an estate in Peckham was evacuated after it was found that the required remedial works simply had not been carried out. In 2018, an estate in Tottenham that had been constructed using the same LPS method as Ronan Point was evacuated, after it was found to be structurally unsound. 9 buildings on the estate were at risk of collapse, and in some cases it was believed that a collapse could have been precipitated by an incident as minor as a car colliding with the base of the building, or a small gas explosion taking place in one of the flats. The collapse of Ronan Point would not be the last high-profile disaster to affect a government-owned tower block in London. To this day, many residents in such blocks live, every day, in structures that are known or strongly suspected to have potentially fatal flaws.